Welcome back to another lens review. I thought I'd have a look at another Minolta lens, not quite so well known this one, but it is a fairly interesting option. It's the 28-105mm, and there are three versions of this lens around. The one that I have today is the later version, the RS or restyled one. All the specs are on screen for you to have a look at. Quick tour of the lens. We have 62mm filter thread, which is on a few of the Minolta lenses that are around from the autofocus era, and the coatings have been a bit updated over the original ones which were present in the mid-80s. This is a screw driven lens, so that means when you rotate the front focus ring you'll see the slot moving, so the speeds are going to depend largely on the camera that's driving that screw mechanism. You'll see the rear elements move forward when you zoom the lens in. This particular copy has been fairly well used, but it has held up quite well considering it's over 20 years old now. We do have the circular aperture blades when it's open. Always give those a quick check with the Minolta lenses just to make sure that there isn't any grease slowing them down. And here's a shot showing you the front focus ring. The restyle version here has the grooves in it, whereas the older version before this has a smooth rubber on the front. Optically though they should be the same. The focal length and apertures, I have put them on screen for you, so by the time you get to just over 50mm you are back down to the f4.5. It's still a bit quicker than a lot of kit lenses which would be at f5.6 at that stage. This does come with a petal style hood, and you just line it up and I'll show you there, lock it in place. It does help with lens flare. Then just reverse it around for storage. I have personally found the lens is pretty good with flare. As this is a full frame lens, I'm going to fit it to a full frame digital body. Remember, the lens is designed in the film era, so some of these lenses work quite well on digital and some have a few flaws or weaknesses. Size wise it's pretty compact for a 28-105. There is a bit of weight though, but it's still a lot lighter than say a 24-70 f2.8. I looked at one of those recently from Tamron. Focus speeds are pretty good with that lens, with that body. Now as far as 28mm wide open, there is some vignetting and barrel distortion, but it is quite sharp in the middle even when it's wide open. Once you go into the corners you will see some softness. F3.5, that tends to clear up. When you start to stop down to around about f5.6 you'll see an improvement, and then take it right down to f8 or even lower, particularly if you're doing things like landscape shots, and you'll see those corners tighten right up and the vignetting pretty much is gone by about f8. Always usually a good idea to stop a lens down on a full frame sensor. You'll notice with the APS-C that it crops out those corners, so you wouldn't stop down as much generally. Once I go to 50mm there is some pin cushion. It's not too heavy, a little bit of vignetting wide open again, but it's not as much as you get with the lens at 28mm, and 105mm has quite a bit of pin cushion, although I have seen worse. It's good wide open though at f4.5 across most of the frame. Just a bit of contrast is missing when the lens is shot wide open at that focal length. And here's a shot of that pin cushion with the lens at a slightly longer distance. Relatively simple distortion to correct, just a -5 I added to this image and it's pretty much got rid of the problem. As far as the background blur and the quality of that, it's generally not a bad lens. I wouldn't say it was great. There is some outlining, but it is fairly smooth in the background. And if I move it over to the 28mm wide open, even though this might not be your own choice for getting a blurred background, it does do a fairly decent job. There is a little bit of chromatic aberration you can see just on the edge of the trampoline that's out of focus there, but overall not a bad job in that area. Give you another shot just to show you the outer focus areas, and I found it to be pretty smooth on this particular shot. It's not at the minimum focus distance, but it's generally quite a decent, respectable job in that regard. Perfectly acceptable for general day-to-day shooting. I wouldn't say it was either great or poor, just a sort of mid-range area. Lens flare performance on this lens is good for the most part. It's very difficult to get lens flare with this. You'll be able to see a small spot that's here, but I had to really try to get that angling around the lens. Real world use, lens flare is generally for the most part quite well controlled. Give you an example of the focal range. Although 28-105mm doesn't seem that exciting, when you're out and about doing landscape shots you will see a significant difference. I've zoomed in there on the building that's in the distance on the hills, and you can see you wouldn't be able to crop in that far. So although it doesn't seem particularly big on paper, it is a useful focal range. Later on, these lenses were replaced with 24 to 105mm to give you that extra wide angle. You can see with these shots that I've done, I'm at 28mm and I'm moving around a bit, changing the focal length. I could get a 28mm prime and get similar compositions to this, but sometimes you're not able to move around as much with your location. Once you stop the lens down for scenic shots, good details and resolution across most of the frame. I found it to be quite consistent over the focal length that you have. There are a few areas where it could be a little bit better. Sometimes you'll want to stop it down a bit more, particularly at the telephoto, the maximum. It does lose a little bit of contrast wide open, but it does have a good performance overall. A little bit of chromatic aberration towards the edge of the frame. I have noticed that, but it doesn't extend into the picture very far. Moving to a close-up shot, this is at the minimum focus distance. It's not too bad for close-up shots. Wide open, f4.5, decent details. As I said earlier, the contrast can be a little bit lower, wide open, so it would be a good idea to stop it down. I've got an APS-C shot now to show you wide open, same focal length, and the details are pretty good. Certainly usable wide open, and I've got a couple more shots to show you. 105mm again, outside. Focus on the pony, it was in the field, and that's a usable shot, although probably would stop down for that. So if you need to use it at the maximum aperture at the top end, it is certainly possible, a respectable result. Just drop it down a little bit if you want that increased contrast. Another shot showing you some of the jaunting cars that they have to carry people around, and they've done a pretty good job. Focus is on the side there by the wheel and the wood grain. So reasonable performance for wide open at the telly end. It does gradually soften up from the 50mm mark, but it is still certainly usable at that focal length. Here's a shot that I took at 90mm. I've stopped the lens down a little bit from the maximum aperture. We're down to f6.3. This is the kind of shot though that you might want to do a bit of correction to that pin cushion. It's not too severe, but it would be something which you would notice, particularly with dead on shots. Resolution across most of the frame though is good, even just stopped down a bit, so a respectable performance at that focal length as well. Testing it out at 50mm, I've stopped it down to f10. Remember, we're on a full frame camera. Just to zoom in, there's a lot of details in this particular shot, and that's a challenge for any lens and camera to get that amount of detail out. And obviously you could argue that you might get better details, or probably will get better details with a 50mm prime, but the lens does a good job in most of the frame. Only really a few areas where it's not quite as good, but this is a very satisfactory result. It's a zoom lens with a reasonable range for a full frame camera. Another landscape shot at 105mm. With this I have the background is slightly out of focus, and I'll just show you the slight chromatic aberration that you get on the edges. Obviously you'd probably want to stop the lens down fully for the depth of field, but the chromatic aberration is a minor distraction. You might notice it occasionally with some tree branches on the edge of the frame. As far as the resolution, even stopped down a little bit, is actually very good on this lens. It surprised me a bit because it's not a particularly well known lens. So there's no obvious huge drops in performance. You do get that drop off at the top end slightly, but if you stop the lens down, that pretty much fixes that. I'm showing mainly landscape shots, but it makes a pretty good general purpose all-round lens. Here's a shot that I took with a sunset. I'm very happy with the quality of the images that I get out of this. What happened is around 2000 Minolta brought out the 24 to 105mm. That lens did in effect replace this one. You'll see it on the right here. I have both. Apart from the obvious difference of 24mm, it's a bit smaller. There's some minor cosmetic differences. It's a bit lighter, but there is more vignetting, there's more distortion, and there is more chromatic aberration. But they are both good lenses. They're very close in performance in terms of resolution, but those are the main differences that I've had using both of these lenses. Not the most common Minolta lens around out there, but available for around about £80–90 second hand, makes it quite a good purchase. So if you're shooting full frame on a budget with a mount, it's certainly a lens which I think is deserving of some attention. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll catch you soon.